Great. Thank you so much. One is welcome to everybody that's here in person as well. I'm Allyson Drake. I'm the founder and executive director at Full Circle Grief Center, and have about 20 years of experience working with children, families, teens, adults as they are grieving. So tonight, I'm just going to share a really high-level overview with you about children and teenagers and how we as adults can support them through grief. But I'm obviously happy to answer, and I'll share my contact information at the end. Happy to answer any questions that are in more detail that anybody may have. So then I'll let Ashley introduce herself too.
Hi, good evening. My name is Ashley Cherry. I am an intern at Full Circle Grief Center. I've been interning since August, and I'll have the honor and privilege to continue interning through the new year. I am a master's student at VCU in the Rehabilitation and Mental Health Counseling program on the mental health counseling track. And so it's great to be here with you all.
Wonderful. So for those of you who are not familiar with Full Circle Grief Center, we are a nonprofit organization located in Rankin County. We've been around for 15 years. We offer counseling groups free of charge for children, adults, and families. We offer a family group called Hands on Healing. We offer for children ages 3 to 18 and their parent primary caregiver. We offer a perinatal loss group, suicide loss group, an overdose and substance use loss group, as well as monthly groups that we offer in general grief topics. So all the information about those programs, those counseling groups, support groups are on our website under support and as groups. We also offer individual counseling services for children, again, starting age 3 and up, and adults, families, couples. We do take most major insurances, and we offer a discount rate for self-pay. We do a lot of consultations with families if they are faced with the impending death of a loved one or grief in their family. Maybe they don't want to sign up for counseling, don't want to sign up for groups, but yet just need some one-on-one support to figure out how to work through a situation. We do that as well, and as well as work with professionals to support a family or an individual that is walking through grief. And then we do a lot of educational programs just like this. We work with schools and different organizations in our community to help dispel some of the myths of grief and loss. So, one of my favorite quotes this hasn't turned yet, but it's really trying, I can see it. There we go. One of my favorite quotes, really, what I look at is what grief and working through your grief is all about. As all of us know in this room and on the screen, if you're dealing with grief, it's not something you can fix. You cannot fix it. No matter how much support and counseling and groups and books you read and all of that, it cannot be fixed because you cannot bring that person back. That loss is the loss that it is, and it's not something that can be changed or healed or fixed. What it can be is a process of working through integrating that loss, processing those feelings that come with it, and learning how to move forward with your grief. So I love this quote, healing from grief is not the process of forgetting, it is the process of remembering with less pain. That was a big focus of us at Full Circle, is finding ways to honor and remember and celebrate how your loved one lived. And that's we'll talk a little bit more about that, but it's really important in the grieving process. So wanted to share some stats. About children in grief. 1 in 5 children will experience the death of somebody close to them by the age of 18. These statistics were from about 5 years ago. And so after COVID and increase in other types of deaths that we're seeing across the nation, such as suicide and overdose loss, unfortunately that number is trending closer to 1 in 4. Children will experience death of someone very close to them, someone in their everyday life by the age of 18. So that means also that 69% of a parent, which this is a really obvious stat, but I want to bring it up just in terms of grief is not just in that moment that it happens. It's a lifelong process. In this survey, 69% of children who lost a parent growing up still think about that parent frequently. So if you were an adult and you had a parent that died when you were 3 or 7 or 12, that doesn't mean that you did your time of your grief and it's over. It's something that you will grieve and experience for the rest of your life. So what we're seeing from teachers and from parents and caregivers as well is that, you know, when children experience a significant loss, a significant grief experience, coming back to the classroom, you often see difficulty concentrating. You see withdrawal. You may see less participation. For some kids, you may see a much increased focus on schoolwork and, you know, I have to get good grades. I have to achieve. I have to be this, you know, good, quote unquote, good, high achieving child. You'll see kids that are missing school. You'll see a decrease in their quality of work and less reliability in training and assignments. So, you know, as adults, you think about when we experience grief and we are expected to go back to work, and we're expected to continue with the roles and the responsibilities that we have in life and how difficult that is for us. And we at least understand grief and loss a little bit more than children do. So then you have children who are then faced to go back in the classroom, maybe days, maybe a week, whatever it may be after the death of their loved one, and they can concentrate. So it's, you know, for teachers, for professionals in schools, and for us as parents, understanding, you know, that it's just not something you can click off, obviously, while you're at school.
Yeah. And just to add a little bit to what Allyson was saying about what teachers seeing in the classroom, in a couple of slides here, I'm going to talk a little bit more about how the interaction of trauma and grief go together. But with those symptoms of, like, you know, not focusing and difficulty paying attention or maybe hyper-focusing, we see even more of that in the case where there is a traumatic element involved with the grief. And so here, when children are supported in their grief, they're much less likely to drop out of school when they have a support system, when they have safe spaces and environments to be able to process what has happened and talk about it. They're also 20% less likely to develop a behavioral disorder. Again, we'll talk a little bit more about trauma and grief later, but what we often see, or what research has shown with traumatic grief, is that when it's not addressed, the trauma is not addressed, that child tends to develop into the regress, which can lead to things like this, what's here, a behavioral disorder, 5 times less likely to complete suicide. Really, really important that we are building spaces and environments where children and teens can be supported, and also 10 times less likely to get involved with substance abuse. So again, what we know about grief and children and teens, as Allyson was saying, as adults we can at least understand a little bit better. Children often have a hard time processing and being able to find safe spaces where they can talk about it, especially if it's in the case where it's a parent that's been lost and the surviving parent is also managing their grief while trying to help the child manage their grief. It can be very difficult. So with some of the groups like the Office Full Circle and some of the work we do here, it can really help to decrease some of these more drastic statistics.
Yeah, and to piggyback exactly what Ashley just said too, you know, in thinking about the children that you are supporting, whether you're a professional listening to this conversation or a parent already a family member, understanding that, you know, yes, there obviously are places like Full Circle, there are school counselors in schools, but also thinking there's so many other ways that children can feel supported. So if counseling is not for your child, if they don't want to go see their school counselor for whatever reason, you know, just understanding that supportive environment can be built at home too. You know, being able to allow children to find that space to talk, and again, we'll expand on that a little bit, whether it's, you know, it may be a coach that they work with that they're able to talk with. It may be their piano teacher. It may be, you know, somebody from their religious organization, whatever it may be. So support can look really different for a lot of kids, but the important piece is that children have at least one person that they can talk to about their. There we go.
All
Yeah. So you'll notice in quotes that we have here normal grief. I don't really believe that there's such thing as normal grief. There's a great quote by, I believe it's William Morgan, who says, everybody's grief is as different as their fingerprint. So you as a parent, as a caregiver, as a teacher in a classroom, you may have 2 children, 3 children that are grieving the same death, but they're going to grieve it completely differently based on their personality, based on their communication styles, based on their past trauma. So many things they're going to grieve differently and in so many different ways. So this is a list that we had one of our groups come up with, one of our team groups come up with. So we'll call it quote unquote normal grief. But again, it looks very different for everybody. Not to generalize, but I will just talk about my personal experience leading groups, is that we'll take a guess here. For teenagers who are grieving the death of somebody significant to them, what do you think is the #1 feeling that we see expressed the most often? I know everybody's got the answer in their head, so I'll go ahead and just say it. Withdrawal, maybe not feeling comfortable with peers, not knowing how to interact with their peers, and feeling really angry. Feeling really angry. And socially, there's systems, whether it's withdrawal or whatever it may be, looked at them as well for many kids. For the little ones, preschoolers, early elementary, a lot of times it's confusion. What in the world just happened? My life just turned upside down and I don't completely understand it. And then middle schoolers, middle schoolers vary quite a bit, but it's a lot of that sadness and many times that anxiety of what's going to happen next. But again, those are complete generalizations. It very much depends on the child and their, so many different factors of how they're responding to their grief.
Yeah, and to add to that on the side of trauma and the interaction of trauma and grief, what we know about traumatic grief is that it basically occurs when the details surrounding the death of the child or the teen's deceased loved one was so sudden, it was threatening in some way, it was particularly dramatic, that it impacts that child or teen's sense of safety, sense of self, and also their sense of identity in the world. And when those interactions of grief and trauma are kind of basically intertwined together or entangled, and that the reactions and the symptoms of what we would call quote unquote normal grief are so closely linked to the traumatic details surrounding the death of the deceased loved one. And it's also something important to take in consideration is that the trauma symptoms or reaction, the child doesn't necessarily have to have any danger at the time of the death. For example, if a parent has a terminal illness, if they've been experiencing cancer, and the child is seeing the in and out of the hospitals and sickness and months and years on end, those memories can become locked in where like the teen or the child might start self-isolating, having a lot of anxiety, a lot of anger, those memories become traumatic. And so, yeah, it's a complex interaction of both. And yeah, same one later, but yeah. Mm-hmm.
So again, there we go. Again, this list is not all-encompassing of how we see grief, how we feel grief, how we experience grief, but I want to show this slide to point out that grief affects us emotionally, mentally, spiritually, physically, and behaviorally. So a lot of times, somebody that hasn't been through a significant death in their life think of grief and they think sadness. That is one part of how grief affects you. And I think when you go through a significant grief experience, sometimes many of these surprise you, especially the mental piece. I think that, the confusion, the inability to concentrate, the waking up in the morning and taking a few seconds to remember that this person has died. Just feeling so out of control, the anxiety. Again, grief is so individual and so unique. but just understanding if you are supporting a child through this, and then let's kick in for our teenagers and our middle schoolers with hormones, let's then click in the stresses and the pressure of school and social situations and navigating all the things that our kids are navigating, then throw in so many different manifestations of grief. And so I think part of our responsibility as adults who are supporting these kids is to understand how grief shows up and then validate for these children. So you're having a really hard time concentrating. Do you know that that's actually really normal for kids that have experienced the death of their grandmother or experienced the death of their parent? Just the validation. So knowing these things and being able to share with kids, my anxiety has really gone up as well. Sometimes it's really hard to understand it, but that's really normal for grief. So just understanding and validating.
Yeah, and so that in understanding and validating the adults and the safe, trusted people in their life, understanding too, again, with trauma and grief, all of these categories, we can touch. There are three main categories that often show up, which is re-experiencing hyperarousal and avoidance. So with re-experiencing, it's like that mind's effort to continue to go over those details and try to make sense of what's happened, like that disarray, that confusion. Often at times, especially with children, we do a lot of creative interventions with our groups, and so they want to try to understand or make a different outcome. And so again, any of those, re-experiencing can show up in any one of these five categories. With hyperarousal, it's that feeling of constantly being on edge. This is especially relevant when you're talking about a child that had their sense of safety or danger compromised, or a sense of their safety compromised with the death of the loved one. That feeling of being on edge or super alert or anxious, easily startled, are all of those things can show up, especially behaviorally. And it's really important to know that, again, for the adults to support them, because we often see children maybe acting out or teens acting out, and sometimes the first expression is to discipline or over-discipline. And so when we can understand what's going on with them, we can better support them and offer different ways to help them. And then avoidance is just when our mind and our body's response is to avoid those reminders. And so again, when we have the grief, and we have trauma, not only do we want to avoid the pain that's associated with that traumatic memory, but we also want to avoid the pain of processing that my loved one is no longer gone. And so as Allyson was saying at the beginning, like healing is that process of remembering with less pain and more joy. I think that's really true here.
So this may resonate with many of you, the next slide that we're waiting for, may resonate with many of you as adults, but also keep in mind, kids may not understand the process of grief as much, but may experience it without really being able to put words to it. So the 7 stages of grief, as a grief person, I don't truly think that grief follows stages. It's not, you go through this, check it off. You go through this, check it off. And many of you probably heard of Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, who is the one who created the stages of grief. She actually, little known fact, she actually meant the stages of grief for people that had a terminal illness and were grieving their life, were grieving what they were going through as they were dying. She did not mean it to be stages of grief left for those of us here who are grieving their loved ones. So kind of ignore that word stages. It's more, yes, we all go through different parts of grief, and we would love it to be on a linear process. We would love, I love my to-do list, and I would love to be able to put my stages or my tasks or my jobs of grief and then be able to check them off when I'm done, and then I'll never have to do that again. But that's not how it works. Unfortunately, grief looks a lot more like I don't know how people are looking at it, kind of on the right. My experience, it's a mess. You feel it's messy. You feel out of control. You feel, I woke up this morning and I actually feel okay. And then by lunchtime, you hear a song, you smell a smell, you see somebody that reminds you of your loved one, and now you are all the way back at anger or sadness or disorganization or whatever it may be. So you can experience all these different things on the left within like a day when you're grieving. So it's just understanding that it does make you feel many times out of control. It makes you feel messy, and it makes you feel, I've had people say to me, it makes me feel like I'm going crazy. And it's very visually validated here. So I'll offer an alternative for you for the stages of grief. They're called the tasks of grief. And again, I do not like the word task either because it implies that we're done. But we'll just go with it. So this is by one of the bereavement gurus, Dr. William Horton. And he introduces the tasks of grief. And I could talk for a whole hour about this, which I will not. But I just wanted to introduce it to you. There's lots of articles, there's lots of books. But it's really, I like this way of thinking about grief is, going through these processes, I guess, accepting the reality of loss. For some people, this is a pretty quick task, if you will. For other people, this takes a really long time. When you have a really small child, this takes a very long time. If you have a child that's a preschooler, an early elementary child who doesn't understand the concept of death. So they may not understand that it's final. They may not understand that their person's not coming back. So as adults, that's the important piece for us is to use the words that are appropriate. Culturally and within your family, what feels appropriate, but making sure that you're not using those euphemisms like, he went on a trip and he's not coming back, or grandma went to sleep and she's not going to wake up, or things like that, because what is the child going to be afraid to do? Go to sleep. The child's going to be afraid when mom, dad, brother, grandma, whoever goes on a trip next time. So using those words, again, that feel good and culturally appropriate for you, but trying your hardest to use the words like they die. This is what death means. Death means that the person's body does not work anymore. And it means that they are not coming back. That there's ways that we can stay connected to them. So, for little kids, it's really hard for a parent who is grieving to have a small child keep coming and having to be told the story again and again, that their dad is not coming back, or their dad has died. And obviously, whatever you feel spiritually or culturally is how you explain it to your child. But for us as adults, it's really hard when that death was sudden, that death was traumatic, that death was unexpected, to accept that reality. That takes a little bit of time, and that's why rituals and funeral processes and cultural rituals, things like that, are super important when you are dealing with the death of a loved one. The one part that a lot of people try to avoid, the next task, experiencing the pain of grief. Reality is that if we try to walk around that grief and not experience and process that grief's going to come back in some other way. It's going to come back physically. It's going to come back through, inability to sleep. It's going to come back as substance use. It's going to come back as reckless behavior, or it's going to come back when 30 years from now and you have gone through another death, or you've gone through another loss in your life. So unfortunately, it is our job to walk through that pain of grief and process that grief, however that may work for you or in your child. Adjusting to the environment with the deceased, saying that's changing roles in a family. What does this mean to our family? How is this going to look and feel as we move forward? Notice I will never say move on, ever. I will use the word moving forward, but actually do kind of make some people angry as well. But it's just, how are we now going to adjust our environment that this person's not here anymore? And then, as I said before, the really important part is maintaining that connection, keeping that person's memory alive, talking, telling stories, honoring them however you feel appropriate as you. And again, some people don't like this, and I'm going to acknowledge this. Some people don't like the word new normal. Some people very much embrace that terminology. So again, very individual, but it's, how do I maintain this connection? If you've experienced the death of a child, how do I continue to mother this child when they're no longer with me? Different things like that. And so just finding ways to stay connected.
Yeah.
I'm sorry, no problem.
And I was going to add to what Alice was saying about it being particularly difficult with the traumatic, right, the trauma of the grief. And so, again, understanding that these grief-related tasks, they're not linear, you know, enter one task and come into another, or you're experiencing all sorts of different ones at different times. One of the things that we understand about the impact of trauma and grief is that it's really also important, especially for children and teens, to address the trauma that's happened. One way that it was described to me is like when somebody is actively in crisis, there's certain work, there's certain spaces that they're not able to engage at. So what that looks like with, in this case is, you know, psychoeducation about trauma, helping that child or that teen to understand what does trauma look like? What are some of those manifestations that we talked about earlier, the behavioral, the mental, the emotional, the physical, helping them to make sense, giving them language for understanding their feelings identifications, like introducing, especially with youth, introducing new feelings to them. I mean, they could probably understand sad or crying, but like maybe guilt is a new one, or maybe, I don't know, like shame is a new one, right? Or there's just anxiousness is a new one, right? Like those are new feelings that maybe they haven't, especially if they're young, like preschool or elementary school age, those are new feelings that they haven't come to understand yet. Once they're able to kind of understand and have language to communicate those feelings, being able to build skills to manage those emotions, those distressing feelings when they come up. Otherwise known as coping skills, which again, it's not a one size fits all. What works for somebody to cope and what doesn't work might not work for somebody else. And then the last thing is the idea of a trauma narrative, which is really just helping the child or the teen to be able to talk about any particular details of the death of their loved one, and gradually decrease like the distressing elements of it. So if it's somebody unfortunately died by homicide, right, and the child maybe wasn't there, but they witnessed it or they heard about it, helping that child to be able to talk about it where there's less hyper arousal or reactions as they discuss it. And again, with those coping skills and that language of their feelings, they can get to a space where they're able to better, go through those feelings and elements.
So one thing I want to acknowledge too, with all the things that Ashley and I both have said, when you are responsible for taking care of a child, whether you're their parent, you are their guardian, you are their grandparent, you're their uncle, whatever it may be, the likelihood is that you're going to be grieving yourself as well. So understanding that we're given all this advice and all these suggestions and all this stuff tonight, but there are many, many times where you cannot be expected to do this on your own. You cannot be expected to every day be in that place where you can say to this child, why don't we sit down and talk about your feelings? Because it may be a day where you barely got out of bed. So it's understanding the resources, understanding what's supported out there for you and for your children, because you cannot do this by yourself if you are grieving yourself. And also being able to set those boundaries with your child. It is so important for me to talk to you about this, but I'm having a little bit of a bad day. I'm feeling really sad right now, and I want to be able to give you my 100% attention. So do you think that maybe tomorrow we could go for a walk? It's giving you permission to be able to say, I can't do this right now. And I'm never one of those people that says, don't cry in front of your children. I think when we model grief behavior, we model how we grieve. That's how a child can feel comfortable coming to you and crying, and coming to you and saying, I'm just really falling apart right now. And I don't mean that your child should be responsible for picking you up off the floor and, being your sole support system. That's not what I'm saying, but I think that it's really important for us as adults to model that grief behavior. Kids do not know how to grieve unless they see somebody else doing it. And so not being afraid to show your feelings, talk about your emotions, talk about the challenges that you're having. And again, not all the time, but we have to model grief behavior. I was working with a client one time who thought I had no idea what I was talking about the whole time that I was working with him. And like every time I suggest, like, you don't know what I'm doing, you don't know what I'm feeling, you don't know whatever. So finally I made the decision to self-disclose that I had experienced the death of my parent as well, and the death of my mom as well. And, you know, from then on, all he wanted to know is, because he didn't have adults around him that were grieving in front of him. He didn't know that it was okay to cry. He didn't know that it was okay. So, you know, of course, I didn't just talk about my emotions and share, you know, it was his session, not mine. But to be able to have an adult to say, yeah, that happens. This is how I feel. Like that kind of stuff is so important to model that for children. So again, very, very individual. But just a couple of things to look out for when you are supporting a child who is going through grief. And I do want to point out too, our program tonight is all about grief as a result of death, but understanding that there are so many different types of grief experiences for kids, and this obviously is much of what we're talking about tonight is very relevant, whether it's grief from moving, grief from a parent being abandoned, you know, the family, whether it's a parent incarcerated, divorce, moving away from their best friends, whatever it may be. There's so many different things. So, but again, I won't read through all these, but it's just understanding that children, we have people that will call us a lot and say, how do I know that my child is grieving? Well, I can't answer that question because I don't know your child. But what I can tell you is that you may be seeing some of these pieces that may not be so obvious that they're related to grief, but they're having a hard time sleeping, if they're having nightmares, if they want to sleep in bed with you, if their teacher is calling a little bit more than often saying that they're, you know, misbehaving in class, or they're falling asleep in class because they can't sleep at night, or they start worrying about things like, what am I wearing, and do these people like me, and what's going to happen, and, you know, or maybe they start regressing in that behavior of wanting to know where you are all the time and wanting to sleep in your bed and not wanting to let you out of your sight. So just knowing that there's different ways that loss impact can show up with a child. But for me, it is this behavior, is this out of character for them? Is this, you know, is this something that is different? And then try to have the parent or the caregiver dig into how is this related to their grief. Oh, okay. Okay, I'll start on this one and we'll jump in. So, resilient kids, and I think resilient is a little misleading. I think it's more kids who may fare better in the grief experience, but I didn't think that was really an appropriate headline, so I just put resilient children. But I think there's a lot of pressure to put on a child to say you have to be resilient because of grief. These are the kids that may fare better and have less struggle, if you will, with their grief. So kids that have that support system. I don't mean socially active like they're a super popular kid. That's not what I mean. I mean kids that have a community around them. They have people they can go to, whether it's a sports team, whether it's a club at school, whether it's their religious organization, whatever it may be. There's kids that have peers who are supportive. And maybe kids don't, let's be real, kids don't really always know how to support each other. I'm not saying that, but kids that have an outlet and kids that feel supported and have a community. Those kids that already had a higher self-esteem, I feel like that's pretty obvious just because those are kids that may know how to ask for help more. These are kids that may be a little more open to sort of sharing what they're feeling. They may be kids that can advocate for themselves more, but again, not total deciding factor, if you will. Fewer daily changes, those kids that maybe can stay in the same school after there's the death of their loved one, that, you know, don't maybe have to move, you know, things like that. They may have fewer daily changes. They're allowed to continue with their activities they're involved in. And again, let's be honest, sometimes this just cannot be helped. Like, and so I don't want anyone that's listening to feel pressure about that. Sometimes the daily changes are necessary to keep that child safe, keep that child in a situation with supportive people, whatever it may be. So, but we're aiming for fewer daily changes. Kids that feel safe, kids that feel secure in their environment. Consistent discipline. Now, this is hard. If you are a parent, caregiver who is grieving yourself, sometimes, as we said before, you don't have the energy to do a lot of things. You may not have the energy to provide that structure and that constant discipline. But I encourage parents to keep the discipline and the expectations and the rules and all the things as consistent as possible, because that makes the child feel safe. So don't feel guilty for punishing your child if they're talking back to you, or whatever it is that you may usually do, or take their phone away, or whatever you normally do, because that's where they're going to feel safe, is in that. Kids that are prepared for the funeral. I get asked a lot when I'm working with families, should I take my child to the funeral? I can't answer that because I'm not this child's parent or guardian or the owner of this child for those situations. But the most important part that I can say is if the child goes to the funeral, prepare them for the funeral. Prepare them that there may be singing, there may be crying, there may be laughter, there's an open casket, there's the loved ones being cremated. What does cremation mean? For our youngest children, making sure they have a space to get out of the wherever the ceremony is, or the celebration of life, or whatever. Maybe they need an out. So Aunt Betty's going to take you out the side door if you feel like that you need to go for a walk. Just making sure that they're prepared, they know what's going to happen. We're going to drive to the cemetery, we're going to go down the stairs in the building, have a reception, just make sure they're prepared. I will say with my little asterisk, I've worked with a lot of kids in the last 20 years. I've never had a child say, I'm mad that I went to the funeral. I've had many, many, many kids say to me, I'm so mad they didn't let me go to the funeral. Now, is going to the funeral best for them? That's what the caregiver and the parent decide. I'm just saying, kids have said that the funeral was really hard when they're not prepared. Let's be real. The funeral is going to be hard even if they are prepared. But just having them have a tiny bit of control of what's happening. And again, it is not for me in any situation to tell a parent or a caregiver what to do with their child. You know that child, and you decide what's best for that child. Staying connected to your loved one, and then, as we said, adults that are modeling healthy grieving. I also have in here parent caregivers functioning well. I think that's a little bit of a, maybe we need to change that wording a little bit. The parent or the caregiver is doing what they need to do to work on their grief, to work through their grief, whatever that looks like. So,
yeah. Yeah, and I like what you said about the word resilient, and I think resilience doesn't equal perfection. And kind of like the stages of grief slide with all the squigglies, right? I think resilience can look like some days the self-esteem is not as high, and there are other things that are happening, but it's about committing, I think, to these things, right? Can we do our best to commit to it? I also wanted to say, just in terms of prepare for the funeral, from experience of being a part of one of our counseling support groups at Hands on Healing and working with the middle school, late elementary school age, that 1000% what Allyson said is true, that there were some youth in there that did not get to go to the funeral, and they shared how that made them feel. And that wasn't, again, it's still up to the decision of the caregiver, but so what Allyson said in her experience of most of the youth have not said that they were upset about going, and then also some that did go that feel that maybe they weren't prepared. So just to the point of being prepared for the funeral, I have seen that it's a very complex decision to whether let the child go or not go, but also in terms of the preparation and having it out and having a space where they can go if it becomes overwhelming, if it becomes too much.
So when I give the end of the day, I can't find the words as well as I normally do, but disclaimer, I don't want anyone sitting in here that feels like, oh my gosh, I didn't let my child through the funeral. I don't want anyone to, for any second, feel that you need to beat yourself up or think you did the wrong thing. You know your child, and you made the best decision that you can make at that moment, and that most likely is the best decision for your child. So I just don't want anyone to think, oh my gosh, who are you to tell me what we should do or not do?
Yeah.
Because you know your child, and you make the best decision for your child.
Yeah.
And that's what matters. So we just have 2 or 3 more slides, and we'll see for any questions. Okay. So somebody asked this question one time when I was doing this presentation, and so I added this slide in here, just in terms of how does grief impact children. And again, I can't answer that because it depends. I can't answer it fully. It's not a cookie cutter answer. So I added this slide to think about, like, how do we assess impact? How do we know how grief or a death of a loved one is impacting a child? So again, we talked about social support systems. What are those that are available for the team? Those are really important. Circumstances of the death. And Ashley said, a sudden traumatic death has a very significant impact on a child, but so does an illness of a parent or illness of a grandparent or whatever it may be. So we can't say, oh, these types of death affect a child more than these types of death. Not true. It really is the circumstances around it, how much the child is exposed to it, and how much the child is allowed to ask questions and process and have things explained to them. Whether or not the person found the body, whether the child witnessed the death, definitely has a greater impact on a child. The nature of the relationship with the person who died. So we have kids that come to our center that had the closest, most amazing relationship with the person who died. We have kids that come to our center that they were a victim of abuse from the person who died. They had a very conflictual relationship with this person. So we got to figure out how to work through that too. The grief looks really different for a child that has a contentious relationship with the person who died versus the child who has more of a harmonious relationship. So working through that a little bit. The child's level of involvement in the dying process, and I want to be clear, that is a very, very individual family decision about how much the child is exposed to a loved one in the dying process. Very individual. So I'm not saying that the child, but I want to be clear. Just because the child is involved and maybe is there when the loved one dies, or is the one who sits and reads stories with the person who's dying, or whatever it may be, that doesn't mean that the grief's going to be harder for them. It just means that they look a little different than the child who was not involved in the dying process. And maybe the child that wasn't involved is really angry they weren't involved. So again, I can't make any generalizations at all about how grief is going to impact a child because it's so situational. But obviously, where the child is developmentally, where the child is emotionally, and then their previous experiences with death impact how grief impacts the child. It's their first loss experience, or they've experienced other significant losses, and this is a cumulative experience with grief. So.
Yeah. So, as Allyson has been saying all throughout, it's really, and there's not a generalization that we can give in terms of what grief is going to look like, how it's going to impact them. No two children grieve alike. It's going to look different. And although there are certain maybe behavioral or physical or mental or emotional things that stand out as common, it really does look differently. Just kind of like adults, when we are grieving the loss of somebody in doses and spurts, that's also happening with children and teens. In addition to the impact of, like, as I was saying earlier, the hormonal, the social, they are, especially for teenagers, they are experiencing that norming of adolescence and youth. And so that's happening in the backdrop of them also grieving. And so it's really important to understand that and understand there could be seasons, months, times when they seem to be completely okay. There's no manifestations of the grief. And then, again, especially if we're talking about traumatic grief, suddenly there's a song or there's an event or something happens that brings all of that kind of back in remembrance. Not that it ever left, not that person, the memory of that person is gone, but the grieving process does ebb and flow. Children and teens can be quick to blame themselves. I think, Allyson, would you say that's especially true of younger ones, or what would you say?
So I think it's across the board.
Yeah.
I'll give an example. I think it's just, the reason we put this up there is just really important. We would think some things that kids think or teenagers think that they have the ability to control. We would never think that they're thinking that, if that makes sense. So I'll give you an example. I worked with a child years ago who, the child and the parent were involved in a parent-child basketball week. And they were going to a game, and they got in a fight in a car about the parent was saying to the child, you're not hustling enough, you're not playing hard enough, things like that about this child's play or effort. So they went to the game, the adults are playing on one side, the children are playing on the other side of the gym. And all of a sudden, the father collapses in the gym. And ends up, the child saw all of it, saw the EMTs come in, trying to revive the child's father, and the father ended up dying in the hospital. So this child comes to my group at least 18 months after this happened. And we were talking about, I quite frankly can't even understand exactly what the activity was that we were doing, I can't remember, but the child came out and said, well, at least you didn't kill your father. And everybody was like, what? And I kept my mouth shut because the kids jumped in, thank goodness, and said, what do you mean you killed your father? Like, what happened? And this child said, we got in a fight on the way. He was mad at me. And I looked it up and it said people die of heart attacks when they're in a high stress situation. And I made him mad. That child had walked around for 18 months thinking that it's his fault that his father died. So again, things that we would never cross our mind that kids think that they're carrying that blame for, many times they are. So as adults, just being mindful and understanding that they may be thinking things, so being honest and clear and age appropriate about what happened and what caused the death, if you have it. And then the last one I just want to point out before you move is the kids may sacrifice their own needs. Kids saying, I don't want to cry in front of my parent because I don't want to make them upset. I'm trying to do chores way more to make things easier for my parent or my grandparents or whatever it may be. So just being mindful of that and watching and making sure your child is getting their needs met and not being so worried about everyone else's needs. Yeah. All right, just to end, because we've gone over pretty much everything that we've said on here for this slide. The next one, so what are we doing? Summary. Yeah. In working with children is we're helping them understand grief. We're giving them space to grieve. We're commemorating and helping them honor their loved one. We're helping them understand that there is life after the death, but helping them navigate what that looks like. And then maybe at some point, and I don't love the pressure of post-traumatic growth that it puts on people, but maybe at some point, understanding and looking at the death as, and how it changed you. I'm not talking about like being thankful for anything, not that at all. It's like, post-traumatic growth is a lot of like, how did this change me and what am I going to do? And then, so I have two just representations to close us out. Is what I feel like this resonates with some people, and then there's the next one that maybe resonates with different people. But I like this one. It says people tend to believe that grief shrinks over time. What really happens is that we grow around our grief. So grief doesn't necessarily get smaller. We just learn how to integrate it. And then the next one is, sometimes when you first, so this is a completely different concept, but again, it may resonate with you and the other one may not, is that grief is this big, heavy stack, big, huge, heavy thing that you carry around. And as the days and the weeks and the months and the years go by, grief gets just a little bit easier to carry. So for some people, we like to think like about growing around their grief, and other people, this feels a little bit more representative of how they feel. So either one's wrong. So we'll stop and answer any questions. I'm sorry we left 2 minutes, but happy to answer any questions.